All right. If you still need questions on 18, Sam is taking care of that. All right, we're ready for 16 and 17, and before we do that, let's review where we are, where we're going. This is our outline of the book of Matthew. We are in the Galilean ministry. But I want us to focus on here for a moment, because we're going to do this when we get to the end of our study. We're going to end on the note of wrapping up these two chapters as it summarizes the third section here. That is, the what the people thought. In the Galilean ministry, this outline focuses on, I borrow this from Baxter, what Jesus taught, what he wrought, and what the people thought. In other words, here's his teaching, here's the evidence, and then here's the reaction that he got. And these two chapters focus on that reaction. We've been focusing on that since chapter 11. And so that's where we are, and that's where we're going to focus. We remind us each time which ministry we're in. We're in the Galilean ministry. We will be till chapter 18. And from there, we're going to move to the later Judean and Perean ministries. Then we get into the Passion Week, which takes up a sizable section of text, but not a sizable period of time. Now, let's review our chapters, the first 15 of those. Chapter 1, genealogy and the birth of Christ. Chapter 2, very good. Visit of wise men and massacre of the children. Chapter 3, John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus. Chapter 4 is a turning point because it deals with, the beginning of the Galilean ministry. It deals with the temptation of Christ. That's not the turning point. It's the beginning of the Galilean ministry. Starts there and ends in chapter 18. So that's the temptation passage. Chapter 5 through 7 deals with Sermon on the Mount. We grouped 8 and 9 together, dealing with miracles and discipleship. We're going to see both of those in our study today. Chapter 10. Apostles chosen, sent out on the limited commission. The Great Commission is going to be recorded in what chapter? Ain't got there yet. This is the limited commission. The great one is in Matthew 28, yes. Chapter 11. John sends messengers, and then that's the invitation. We often talk about the invitation of Christ. Chapter 12, part of this reaction that was starting in chapter 11. Pharisees find fault. Chapter 13, his parables grouped together. Chapter 14, part of the reaction. John the Baptist is beheaded, but that story is told because really the point is the reaction that Herod had concerning the teaching of Christ. He thought John was raised from the dead, perhaps. It's really a focal point on the reaction toward Christ. Chapter 15, eating with unwashed hands. Just, again, that criticism and that fault. Last call on next week's questions. Anybody? Chapter, right over here, Sam. All right. Now, let's get into chapter 16. Question number 1, the main point of chapter 16. All right, the question to Peter. All right, this is the beginning of the church and the kingdom. I call it Peter's confession, but there's more to it than that. That's just kind of a quick summary of the chapter. It is a question that was given to Peter. But before we even get to that, there is more of this opposition. And the storyline seems to be the reaction that Jesus is getting. And we're going to summarize that here in a moment, put all this together. But in this chapter, you have rejection, ignoring and rejecting. In the first 12 verses, you have the accepting of the disciples and the confusion of the world. There's at least three different reactions right here in this one chapter. And we're going to list more than that before we get through. So start watching for reactions. In other words, as we go through a section, watch for, was this ignoring Christ? Was this rejecting Christ? Is this accepting Christ? Is this a shallow following of Christ? Is this section dealing with people are not ready to accept the Christ? We're going to see all of those in these two chapters before we get through. All right, let's get another question. Question number 3. Why is the doctrine of the Pharisees referred to as leaven? Make some application of present-day doctrines, etc. Why is it called leaven? Yes, it has to do with how the doctrine spreads and how it permeates and how it affects. Error is like leaven. If you have dough that is unleavened and you put just a little leaven in it, it's going to permeate and corrupt the whole lump. That's the principle, 1 Corinthians 5 and other texts, through the book of Leviticus, etc. So the same principle is true of false doctrine. False doctrine can permeate and destroy societies, destroy a church, etc. And thus, that's why books like Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians are all written as to offset the leavening effect of false doctrine. Make sense? All right, let's get another question. Question number 4. What does the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, verse 18, mean? All right, not going to be able to destroy it. Good. Anything else? Yeah, his plan is going forth, and the forces of evil are not going to be able to offset that. We'll say more about that in a moment. Let's work our way through chapter 16 now and the first 12 verses. Again, the focal point is on the Pharisees now and their reaction. The Pharisees and the Sadducees came. By the way, here's an interesting thought as you read through not only this text but all the gospel records. The Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't get along. These are not close companions. These are not bosom buddies. They have extremely differing doctrines on the resurrection. They fought on the resurrection. They claim commonality of being Jews, that's true, but they were different sects. That is S-E-C-T of the Jews, different sects of the Jews, and they didn't get along. But this happens in our own day and time. Quite often, people who are enemies of one another become best of friends when they have common enemy. This time it's Christ. They're going to band together. So the Sadducees and the Pharisees, while we may differ with one another, we've got a common enemy, and that's Christ, and so they band together. So what do they do in verses 1 to 4 now? They ask for a sign. What are they asking for? His proof of his deity, proof of his claim. Has he already given proof of his claim? He's given miracle after miracle after miracle. This is well into his ministry. Remember, we've already had the early Judean ministry. We're well into the Galilean ministry. There has been numerous miracles that have been performed. For example, just turning a few chapters back, you have the feeding of the 5,000, you have the feeding of the 4,000, you have the many that are healed. It's walking on the water, etc., and stories that are being circulated and told about that. So what they're asking is not, we want to see another miracle. Because based on what you know about the Pharisees, if he worked another miracle in front of them and raised someone from the dead, or spoke and someone died, or someone was blind and he healed them, what's their reaction going to be? Show us another sign. Yeah, this is not what we're looking for. Yeah, attributed to the power of Satan, or he did it on the wrong day, on the Sabbath day. So they ignore the miracle and find some fault with the miracle. And that's why Jesus doesn't perform another one here. But what's his reaction to them? Verse 2 and 3. He rebukes them. Yes. He basically is saying, this is absolutely amazing that you can look to the sky and you can determine from the things you see. It's not written in the sky that it's going to rain or it's going to be a good day, but you can look and deduce from the evidence that's there and draw the right conclusion. But you can't look around and see these miracles and draw the right conclusion. In other words, it's like Jesus worked a miracle, but he never, what's that supposed to prove? They can't draw the conclusion. So let's go back to verse 2. He says, when it's evening, you can say the weather's going to be fair because the sky is red. You can look at the sky and determine, we can see the evidence that it's fair weather. Or, on the other hand, he said it verse 3, in the morning you say, it's going to be a foul weather day. We're going to have terrible weather today because it's red and it's threatening. And you can discern that, but you can't discern the signs of the time. In other words, you can't look at the miracles and somehow conclude from that what's going on. And so that's why he says at verse 7, you're a wicked and adulterous generation. Why does he call them wicked and adulterous? They have a complete rejection of all that is right. They have a complete rejection of God. They have a complete rejection of the evidence. And that kind of attitude of rejection of the deity of Christ, rejection of the evidence, leads to wicked and adulterous behavior. So he says, no sign shall be given but that of the prophet Jonah. What's his point? First of all, what does he mean by no sign shall be given? I'm not going to work signs. I'm not going to give evidence. In light of what he's already done, it must mean I'm not going to give more of the same kind of evidence to you in this setting because, finish the sentence, you'd ignore it. It won't do any good. In other words, let's put that in a modern setting. Somebody questions whether baptism is essential, and you show them Mark 16:16, and you show them Acts 2:38, and you show them 1 Peter 3, and they say, okay, but can you cite me a scripture that teaches that baptism is essential? Do you need to cite another one? You reject those, 10 more is not going to help anything. They're going to reject those too. If they reject those solid, clear passages, they'll reject everything else. And so I probably wouldn't bother to cite another one. I'm not giving any more. I've given you 3 and you reject those. What if I went to Galatians, or what if I went to another passage? You're not going to accept any of that either. So just forget it. That's what Jesus is doing here. So what does it mean there's no sign will be given but that of the prophet Jonah? He doesn't elaborate here, but he does in John 2. Speaking of his resurrection, that is, Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, then so the Son of Man would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And so it's a prophecy of his resurrection. Now, quite often your charismatic friends, when you tell them, they say they can work miracles, and you say, well, show me a sign. They'll quote this passage, no sign shall be given but that of the prophet Jonah. And my answer to them is, that one will do. Let's see it. Because the one that said he had the claim said he could be buried for 3 days and rise again. And if you think you can do that, then let's bury you and let's see you rise in 3 days. That one will do. That one will do. But that was said in the context of miracles already being performed. Remember that? And we hadn't seen any today. Does that make sense? How they abuse that. But I don't want to lose focus of what's going on. They reject him and consequently are wanting more evidence. Now 5 through 12. Jesus left and went to the other side. The disciples came and they forgot to take bread. And when they get there, Jesus warns them about what? The leaven of the Pharisees. Warned them about the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they began to reason among themselves. What's he talking about? What do they think? He's saying something about us not bringing bread, because they're only thinking in the sense of leaven as it is associated with bread. And he rebukes them, saying, oh, you have little faith. Why do you reason that among yourselves? Because what's his point now? About reminding them of 2 miracles. Yeah. Have you forgotten the 5,000? Have you forgotten the 4,000 that was fed? You not bringing bread's not a problem. It wasn't in those occasions. And so have you forgotten the miracle? And so when he got through explaining it to them, what was he talking about? They finally understood, verse 11 and 12. The leaven refers to the doctrine that it has a leavening effect. Here's a footnote, practical lesson. If you don't have any of those down here under question number 10, and that is, if you don't have this, that false teaching has a leavening effect. Someone goes to a church and they say, you know what, let me back up before I say that. I'm convinced that there's some brethren who think false teachers teach false doctrine every time they open their mouth. Not so. Most false teachers teach more truth than they do error. You go to the Catholic Church and you listen to the Catholic priest, he's going to tell you more truth than he does error, but he's going to tell you a lot of error, but he's going to put that encompassed with a lot of truth. And so even among brethren, there's some who are false teachers, and you go listen to him and you say, well, I heard him preach a great sermon. Man, he's not a false teacher. That's not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is the error, the little error he teaches. And that little error is like a leaven that begins to permeate and corrupt. Does that make sense? The effect of false teaching is like a leavening effect. All right. Now, let's kind of get a preview. Let's peek a little bit as to what we're going to see at the end, and that is the kind of effect. What have we seen so far in verses? Well, I see 2 or 3 reactions here. That's what we're focusing on, the reactions to Jesus. One is rejection, ignoring and rejecting. Would you agree with that? They're ignoring him, they're rejecting. Well, what do we have here with reference to the disciples, verses 5 to 12? They are a little bit slow catching on. They're accepting Christ, but they're a little slow catching on. He rebukes them for not thinking that bread's no problem, because he's worked miracles before, he can do that again. So coming without bread over here, that's not a big deal. They're a little slow catching on. That's part of the reaction being recorded here. And then there is a reaction of the danger of those who react, and that is the leaven of the Pharisees. Let's go further. Let's talk about 13 to 28, who Jesus is and what it means. Now we're going to see a broader picture of what the world is saying. Jesus came into the coast of what? Caesarea Philippi. Let's see if we can find Caesarea Philippi on our map. And it's right here, Caesarea Philippi. This is the Sea of Galilee. He's been working in and around the Sea of Galilee, and Caesarea Philippi is up here near Mount Hermon. So that's where Jesus is at the time of this. He comes into the coast of region of Caesarea Philippi, and he asks his disciples what? Whom do men say I am? Focusing on reaction. And who are men talking about? What are they saying I am? And what were the answers? John the Baptist? Let's take them one at a time. Why would some think maybe he's John the Baptist? John the Baptist been beheaded. Well, it could be simply because Herod had the reaction. Remember, this may be John the Baptist raised from the dead. How much that rumor had spread or that reaction had spread, maybe that's why that going on. What else did they say about him? Elijah? Why would they think he might be Elijah? Yeah, the Jews had thought the Elijah was coming back because of the prophecy of one coming in the spirit and the power of Elijah, talking about John the Baptist. But they thought Elijah was coming back from the dead. So maybe this is that Elijah that came back from the dead. So I can understand where some of this is coming from. Here's a footnote. Sometimes erroneous thoughts have, and I'm going to put in quotations, logical explanations. I see where they come from. It's wrong, but I see where they got it. Does that make sense? You ever, for example, let's forget the context we're talking in and just go to is baptism is essential or is faith alone saved? When someone goes to a passage that says, therefore being justified by faith, we have peace with God, Romans 5. I can see where they understand from that faith is all that's necessary because it said being justified by faith. I know that they missed some things, but I see where they got the point. So I understand why some thought he might be Elijah. What else did they say about him? One of the prophets. Or also, there was another prophet they specifically mentioned, Jeremiah. His work was similar to Jeremiah. The effect was similar to Jeremiah. Consequently, those were some things. But then he turns and directs a pointed question to Peter and said, who do you say that I am? And Peter said, or he said to them, not just to Peter, but Peter was the one that answered, you are the Christ, the Son of God. And when he said, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, that son of Jonah, what did he say about where he got that message? From the revelation of the Father. He didn't make that up. He didn't hear it from men. He didn't hear it from the Sadducees, Pharisees, or the rabbis. He heard it got it from the revelation from the Father. All right, now here's a reaction. The disciples are understanding the world is confused. You see that? World is massively confused. The disciples understand him to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. They understand that. So we're getting different reactions here. Now, on that principle of him being the Son of God, he makes a promise to build the church, which is called the kingdom in verse 19. And when he says the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it, I think he's talking about his, even though he's going to die. Verse 21, I think that is probably what he had in mind, because he's going to die, and when he dies, his body is going to go to the grave, and then his spirit into the realm and the Hadean realm. And the fact that he's going into the Hadean realm, in other words, the fact that I'm going to be killed and die, is not going to prevent the establishment of the kingdom. It's actually a prophecy of his resurrection. Does that make sense? And there's two prophecies in this text already of the resurrection. We're talking about evidence, and that's more evidence indeed. Now in verse 20, he gave them a command. Here's what you need to do. Don't tell anybody. Sounds kind of contrary to what he's trying to accomplish, doesn't it? But we've talked about this several times. This is 3 or 4 times we've seen this. He's not ready for full disclosure. He's not ready for the masses of people to follow him yet. He's trying to build his base and foundation. But also another reaction I'm seeing in this flow of context, it seems that the world is not prepared to accept him just yet as a whole. They're confused. So don't go spread this everywhere just yet. But later we're going to see when they are to do that. And when was that? Chapter 17, remember? Verse 9, 17:9. You go tell that after his resurrection. Yeah, after the death and resurrection. All right, let's go further. Let's get the rest of chapter 16. Verse 21 to 23. He tells them about his death. He tells the disciples, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to suffer many things. Chief priests and scribes and elders, they're going to kill me, and I'll be raised the third day. Do you think they understood that? No, because let's fast forward now. When the resurrection comes, they go to the tomb and find it empty, and what's their reaction? Surprised. But he had told them. What's Peter's reaction? Verse 22. Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you. Now, let's just pretend that we don't have the rest of that chapter. That seems like a noble reaction, doesn't it? In other words, I'm not going to let them do it to you. This shouldn't happen. You say they're going to kill you, and they're going to mistreat you, and they're going to beat you, and they're going to kill you, and all of that. But Peter said, far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you. But the Lord didn't think much of that. What did he say? Get thee behind me, Satan. You're an offense to me, for you're not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. What's he saying by that? Yeah, his focal point's wrong. Now, follow this, and you might make a marginal note. Follow this in context. You'll see the same thing in Mark's account. You see it right here. Then Jesus said to his disciples, I'm reading verse 24. We're going to get to this in a moment. Any man that desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Couple that with, you're mindful not of the things of God, but the things of men. Peter's problem was, Peter was not thinking about the Lord. Peter was thinking about himself. Is that not implied in the context? It's obvious here. It's obvious in Mark 8. That's what brought this discussion on about denying yourself. That Peter, you're not thinking about the things of God that must be done. You're not understanding how this has to be done, that the will of God might be accomplished. You're not understanding that. You're thinking and focusing on yourself. And when you do that, you're following the trends of Satan, verse 23. So get thee behind me, Satan. You're not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. Peter is thinking about himself. Now, I want to tie that together. Let's finish that chapter. He's telling Peter, if you're going to be my disciple, it's going to cost you. Not only is it going to cost me, it's going to cost you. So here's the cost of discipleship. This is still part of the reaction. Look at verse 24. If anyone desires to come after me, let him. He first of all has to deny himself. Peter, that's what you're not doing. And take up his cross. The cross was a symbol for death. It's a means of execution. That doesn't mean that the disciple is always going to die, but it may mean the disciple may have to die. Powerful point to Peter. Not only am I going to die, Peter, it may mean that you'll have to too. You think about that. The Lord is saying, they're going to kill me. They're going to kill me. And Peter said, oh, no, that ain't going to happen. You're thinking only about yourself. Not only will I have to die in this, you may have to too. And he did. Peter's not understanding that. Now, what's the point of 25, 26, and 27? All of that section has to do with this idea. Back to, I think the key back is in verse 23, focusing on things of men, not the things of God. Focusing on self and thinking on the things of men. We need to learn to, he's telling to Peter, you need to learn to say no to yourself. It's not about you, it's about the Lord. You need to take up your cross. You need to follow me. You don't need to desire to save your life. You need to be interested in being a disciple of the Lord. And the most important thing is the salvation of your soul, not the salvation of this life, etc. Make sense? In the interest of time, I'm going to drop down to verse 28. He's continuing that thought of the cost of discipleship, but he talks about how that some standing here would not die until they saw the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, talking about the establishment of his kingdom. Focusing on reaction, what kind of reaction he got. And I'm getting some mixed signals from the disciples, aren't you? What kind of mixed signals are we getting from the disciples? All right. And so what I'm learning from that is that we very well may be strong, and I put strong in quotation, disciples of the Lord. We fully believe who he is and believe he's telling the truth, but we're not grasping it yet. Is that possible? Sure. Slow to understand. Shallow discipleship. We're going to see that toward the end of chapter 17. Let's move to chapter 17. This deals with the transfiguration. Primarily, there's more to it than that, but we have here the transfiguration. The transfiguration is more evidence. Now, there are miracles that are mentioned here, by the way. There's the transfiguration. There's the healing of the epileptic son. There's the foretelling of his death and his resurrection again. And though that miracle doesn't happen here, it is the forecast of that miracle, or the prophecy rather. And then there's Peter getting money from the fish's mouth. So there's miracles here that assure that what the reaction should be. And we'll come back to that reaction. Let's go to the transfiguration here now. The question is, where does this take place? And after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and brought them to a high mountain by themselves. Where did that take place? Well, the answer is, I don't know. Tradition says it was down here at Mount Tabor. And that's down here at this right down here is Mount Tabor. This is the Sea of Galilee. But many think because he was in the region of Caesarea Philippi, it may take place at Mount Hermon. It really doesn't matter, but tradition says Mount Tabor, but some mountain near Galilee is where this obviously takes place. Now let's talk about what happened on the mountain. Verse 2 says he was transfigured. What does that mean? Changed. And his face shined like the sun, his clothes became bright, white like as light. And there also appeared Moses and Elijah talking with him. How could that be? For one, Moses and Elijah are physically dead, but they have spirits that live on, don't they? All right? And so Peter made a proposal. We see he was transfigured with Moses and Elijah. Moses seemingly standing for the prophets. Elijah would represent, Moses represents the law. Elijah would represent the prophets. He's at the head of the prophets. I don't mean he's at the beginning of the prophets. I don't mean he's head in the sense of having power over. But Moses is at the head of the law. Elijah is at the head of the prophets. And there's going to be a point made about that. But Peter, in the meantime, makes a proposal. Let's make 3 tabernacles. Going to worship them all. And while he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice from heaven, and the Father said, "This is my beloved Son." Here is the greatest testimony of all. When the Father says, "This is my Son," it's one thing for someone to say, "That is the Son of God," but the Father himself to say, "This is my Son," that's twice that's happened. The other occasion was his baptism, Matthew chapter 3. I don't know how I got back to that. But anyway, the Father's voice, and then Jesus comforts his disciples. But what's interesting now, while he was still speaking, the cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice from heaven saying, "In whom I'm well pleased." But then look at verse 8. As Jesus comforts the disciples fell on their face, and they were greatly afraid, and Jesus came and he touched them and told them not to be afraid. And when they lifted up their eyes, what did they see? Only Jesus. Now, you think about that. Here's the law and the prophets represented, and here's the Christ. And this is my beloved Son. What does that say to, this is a book that is written with focal point to the Jews. The law and the prophets point to the Messiah, to the Christ. And the Father says, "This is the Son of God." So any Jew who believed in the law and the prophets should now accept and embrace the Messiah, the Christ. Make sense? The law and the prophets just gave testimony to that. All right, let's see if we can make our way through the rest of this. Now, the discussion again was to tell no one until he was raised from the dead. And so then the question came up, well, then what about this? We're confused about Elijah. Why did they say that Elijah was coming? What's his answer to that? He's already come. In what sense? In John the Baptist. He came in the spirit and the power of Elijah. He was like unto Elijah. He was not Elijah raised from the dead. Now here is the healing of the epileptic son, and here's the focal point is really on the disciples more than on the healing of the son. The miracle that Jesus performed shows indeed his claim is true, but what was the problem here? Before Jesus did that, the disciples had tried and failed. Why did they fail? Their lack of faith. Here's an interesting point. Remember this passage. You talk to modern day faith healers, miracle workers, and they'll say, "I can't work a miracle for you because you don't have faith." Jesus said the disciples couldn't work it, not because the son didn't have faith, but because the miracle worker didn't have enough faith. Big difference. But anyway, here's part of the reaction of that we're recording, is that their faith, though it's there, is not strong enough. And he rebukes them for that. Jesus then again, 22 and 23, foretells of his death and his resurrection. That he'll be killed the third day and he'll be raised, and on the third day he'll be raised. And they began to be exceedingly sorrowful. I'm going to make a point about that in just a moment. I want to get this miracle because I'm getting down. I want us to summarize all this. Peter comes to the temple and they don't have a temple tax to pay. And then Jesus has him to go out and cast and pull up a fish, and when you open its mouth, there will be the coin. You go pay the temple tax. What a miracle. Again, evidence of his claim. Now, we can say more about that miracle, but I want to trace some things because this is the focal point of these chapters. Let's do this right here in the time we got left. Here's the reaction that we recorded. There's 4 different reactions. There's the Pharisees, first of all. In the first 12 verses of 16, what reaction is Jesus getting? Ignoring and rejection. There's miracle after miracle after miracle. They ignore it. We want to see a sign. So they're ignoring the evidence he gives and rejecting him in spite of the evidence. That's one reaction. Here's a second reaction. the disciples. There's three reactions I see in the disciples. They are slow. I don't mean slow mentally. They're slow catching on. They may be bright mentally. That's not the question. They're slow, they accept, and they're shallow. Slow in what sense? They had forgotten about, well, we brought bread, remember that? He's talking about maybe rebuking us for not bringing bread. They've forgotten about the 5,000 and the 4,000. Peter's reaction is a little slow, catching on that if Jesus says he's going to die, he's going to die. And if he's going to be raised, he's going to be raised. He was rebuked for saying that. Chapter 17, 14 to 21, same kind of principle. But they did accept his messiahship. But what do I mean by shallow? Here's a point. We'll make this next week as well. Let's go back to 17:23. You might draw a line from them being exceedingly sorrowful to chapter 18 in verse 1. Next week we begin on the question, what question are they arguing about? Sorrow for Christ soon turned to focus on themselves. Pretty shallow, isn't it? We do that. We're all focused on Christ. We're all focused on being sorrowful for all that we've done. And then soon, in just a few hours, we turn back on ourselves and our focus is on ourselves. That's shallow discipleship. That's part of the reaction recorded here. The world reaction was they were confused and they're not ready. They're confused because they're saying, well, he's John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. But they're not ready to accept it yet. So that's why twice in this context, don't go tell, don't spread it everywhere. And then the Father's reaction was, this is my son. Now, if Baxter be right in his outline of this book, and I think he is, that this section, chapters 11 to 18, focus on the reaction that he got in Galilee. And what was it? Ignoring, rejecting. Disciples, yes, a little slow catching on, and at times kind of shallow, but they did accept him. The world's confused. They're not ready for him, but the Father keeps saying, this is my son. Does that make sense? Make sense? Very good. That's what I was waiting on, George. Thank you. All right. In these chapters, we see the glory of Jesus, the power of Jesus, and reaction to Jesus. That's not my outline. Somebody else did that. There's the glory seen in the transfiguration, the power seen in his miracles, the reaction, the rejection of the world and the Pharisees, but the disciples followed after him. Question number 10. We've got about a minute maybe or 30 seconds. Practical things you take home with you. Yeah, we can predict what the temperature on the moon is going to be next month, but we can't take evidence of a text and draw the right conclusion from that. Yeah, miss the simple. Miss the simple. What else? Practical. It ain't gonna work. Absolutely. It's not the weakness of the evidence, it's the weakness of the mind. You're right. You're exactly right. Good point. Good point. I'm seeing more this time. I hope you are. I'm seeing more this. We've been through Matthew for years and years. But I'm seeing more this time, and I hope you are, the reaction that he was getting, the varied reaction. And I hope you're seeing it as well.